Paris is burning, not with fire, with fury. The year is 1649. The streets outside the Palais Royal are loud with torches and rage. Inside, a boy of 10 lies still in his bed, pretending to sleep, while his mother whispers urgently to men in dark coats. He is the King of France, and tonight he is running. They bundled him into a carriage before dawn. No ceremony, no procession, just cold air and the sound of wheels on cobblestone, and the understanding settling into his bones like winter that being king and having power were not the same thing. They would never be. Before we begin tonight's journey, if these stories find their way into your evenings, please do subscribe to the channel and leave us a comment. Tell us whose life you'd like to explore next. Rest now and take a deep breath. We are going back, further back than that cold carriage, further back than the riots, further back than the fear. We are going to a quiet morning in September, the year 1638, when the fields around Saint-Germain-en-Laye still held the last warmth of summer, and the bells of the royal chapel had not yet begun to ring. A woman lay exhausted in a candle-lit room. 23 years of waiting, 23 years of an empty nursery and unanswered prayers. And then a cry. Small, insistent, alive, Louis Dieudonné, gift of God. This is the bedtime biography of Louis XIV. Chapter 1. The Gift of God. September 5th, 1638. Saint-Germain-en-Laye, France. The chateau sits on a bluff above the Seine, and on this particular morning the air carries the faint smell of wood smoke and turned earth. Autumn arriving quietly at the edges of summer. Inside, the corridors are unusually still. The servants move in hushed clusters. The courtiers wait. Anne of Austria has been in labor since the previous afternoon. She is 36 years old. She has been Queen of France for 23 years, nearly half her life, and in all that time she has buried 3 pregnancies and endured the particular cruelty of a court that never lets a queen forget her primary obligation. An heir, a son. Something to prove the marriage was more than a diplomatic arrangement between 2 crowns that barely tolerated each other. Louis XIII, her husband, is a complicated and melancholy man. He loves order, he loves hunting, he loves, in his quiet and somewhat tormented way, France. He does not love Anne, not in any warm or sustaining sense, and she has long since made her peace with that. What she needs from him is not affection. What France needs from both of them is simpler and more urgent, a child who lives. And then, on the morning of September 5th, one does. The cry fills the room before the midwives can speak. The courtiers outside the door go rigid with attention. Someone runs. Someone else begins to pray. And within the hour, the news moves through the corridors of Saint-Germain-en-Laye with the speed of something people have been holding their breath for a very long time. A boy, healthy, breathing, alive. Louis XIII, when told, reportedly wept. It is one of the few moments in the historical record where the reserved and difficult king appears entirely undone. He had been married to Anne since 1615. He had watched the years pass, watched the hope thin, watched the court's quiet judgment accumulate like dust in an unused room. And now this, a son, an heir, a future. The baby is christened Louis Dieudonné. Louis, the gift of God. It is a name given in gratitude, but it is also, from the very first moment, a kind of instruction. You are not simply a child. You are an answer to a prayer. You are the continuation of a dynasty. You are what France has been waiting for. No infant can understand this, of course. but the weight of it settles immediately into the world around him, into the ceremonies that begin almost before he stops crying, into the faces of the courtiers who study him for signs of weakness or strength, into the prayers that are said on his behalf in churches across France by people who have never and will never see his face. He is 4 days old when his father first holds him before the assembled court. He is still weeks old when the formal portraits begin. His mother gives him something more durable than any title. She gives him her absolute conviction that kings are chosen by God, that the authority of a monarch is not granted by men, but by heaven itself, and that this authority, properly understood, is total. Anne of Austria believes this the way some people believe in the ground beneath their feet. It does not occur to her to question it, and she passes it to her son not as an argument, but as a fact, as natural and unshakable as the seasons. It is perhaps the most consequential thing she ever does, because the boy who grows up inside this belief, who is bathed in it, schooled in it, confirmed in it every day by every gesture of every person around him, will spend his entire reign trying to make it real, trying to become in practice what he has always been told he is in theory, absolute, divine, unquestionable. Whether he ever truly succeeds is a question this story will sit with for a long time. For now, in the golden September light of 1638, he is simply a child, small, loud, new to the world, and the world already expects everything from him. Chapter 2. A King at 4, May 14th, 1643. The Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, France. Louis XIV has been dying for months. Everyone at court knows it. The hollow cough, the long silences, the way he sits by the window and watches the gardens as though memorizing them. He is 41 years old, and he looks 20 years older than that. The illness that has consumed him, tuberculosis, most historians believe, complicated by other ailments, has reduced a proud and difficult man to something fragile and diminished. He has made his peace with God. He is making, slowly, his peace with France. What he has not made peace with is the question of what happens next. His son is 4 years old, 4 years and 8 months to be precise, old enough to wave from a balcony, old enough to be dressed in miniature versions of royal clothing and paraded before ambassadors, not nearly old enough to govern a kingdom of 19 million people that is currently fighting a war with Spain. Louis XV knows this, and so, in the weeks before his death, he attempts to arrange the future as carefully as a man can arrange anything from a sickbed. He does not trust his wife to rule alone. This is not perhaps entirely fair to Anne. She is capable, and she will prove it. But Louis XV has spent their marriage in a state of mutual wariness that never quite resolved into either love or respect. He draws up a regency council. Anne will serve as regent, but her decisions will require the approval of a committee of nobles. It is a hedge, a constraint built from suspicion. Anne moves faster than he anticipates. 3 days after her husband's death, she petitions the Parlement of Paris, the powerful judicial body composed of nobles and high clergy, to annul the Regency Council entirely. The Parlement agrees, and just like that, with a legal stroke that takes less time than a morning's breakfast, Anne of Austria becomes sole regent of France. She will not rule alone, however. She knows better than that. The man she trusts, the man she has trusted for years, in ways the court has always gossiped about and historians have never fully resolved, is Cardinal Jules Mazarin. Italian by birth, French by ambition, Mazarin is one of the most gifted political operators of his age. He is subtle where others are blunt, patient where others are impulsive. He understands people, their vanities, their fears, their pressure points, with a fluency that feels almost predatory, though he deploys it with enough charm that most of his targets never notice. He was Louis XIII's chief minister in the final years of that reign, and now he slides into the same role under the Regency without so much as a pause. He is also Louis XIV's godfather. The little king does not fully understand any of this. How could he? He attends the ceremonies required of him, and there are many, because a king, even a child king, must be seen to exist, must be visible and present and appropriately regal. He is dressed and displayed and guided through the choreography of royalty with the patient efficiency of a theatrical production. He waves. He sits still. He watches the faces of the adults around him for cues about what expression to wear. He is a remarkably composed child by most accounts. There is something in him, some early instinct toward self-containment, that allows him to endure the ceremonies without obvious distress. He observes, he stores, he says relatively little and notices a great deal. Mazarin takes his education seriously, though not in the conventional academic sense. He does not produce a scholar. He produces something he considers far more useful, a king who understands the theater of power. Louis is taught history, not as dates and battles, but as a gallery of decisions and their consequences. He is taught Latin, Spanish, and Italian to varying degrees. He is taught to ride, to hunt, to dance, and dancing in the court of 17th century France is not a frivolity. It is a demonstration of grace, control, and physical authority. The king who moves well through a ballroom sends a message as clearly as any diplomatic letter. Louis becomes an exceptional dancer. It is one of the first things he is genuinely good at, one of the first arenas where his own body, his own choices, produce results he can feel. He performs in court ballets, takes leading roles, practices with serious dedication. At the age of 12, he dances the role of the rising sun in a court performance, Le Ballet de la Nuit, and something in that image locks into place. The sun, rising, central, inevitable, the source from which all light proceeds. He will return to that image for the rest of his life. But childhood, even royal childhood, is not only ceremony and ballet. There are ordinary hours, hours that the historical record tends to neglect because they produce no treaties and advance no campaigns. Louis has a younger brother, Philippe, born 2 years after him, and the two boys grow up in careful proximity, close enough to be companions, separated enough to be constantly reminded that one of them is the king and the other is not. Philippe is more openly emotional, more interested in fashion and art and the social texture of court life. Louis is quieter, more watchful. They are fond of each other, in the constrained way of brothers raised inside a system that has decided everything about them in advance. And then there are the fears. Louis nearly drowns as a young child, an incident serious enough to be recorded, though the details are vague. He is sometimes ill. He experiences in those years of constant movement between chateaux a rootlessness that the adult king will spend decades and unimaginable sums of money trying to remedy. He has no fixed home. He belongs to France before he belongs to himself. Mazarin watches all of this, notes it, shapes it where he can. He is training the boy not merely to be a king. There are tutors and governors for that. He is training him to be this particular kind of king. A king who understands that authority is projected before it is exercised. That appearance and reality in the world of courts and diplomacy are sometimes the same thing. Louis is 9 years old. He is absorbing every lesson. What none of them know yet, not Mazarin, not Anne, not the courtiers who watch the small king process through their corridors, is that somewhere in the city of Paris, a storm is quietly gathering, and it is coming for all of them. Chapter 3. The Night They Fled. January 5th, 1649. The Palais Royal, Paris. The city has been restless for months. Anyone paying attention, and Mazarin pays attention to everything, could feel it building through the autumn. The murmurs in the markets, the sharpening tone of the pamphlets circulating through the streets, the particular quality of silence that falls over a crowd when it is deciding something. Paris, in the winter of 1648, is a city that has run out of patience. The trouble has roots that go deeper than any single grievance. France has been at war with Spain for over a decade. War is expensive. Mazarin has funded it through a series of financial measures that the Parlement of Paris, the powerful body of noble judges who must register royal edicts into law, finds increasingly intolerable. New taxes, reduced salaries for officials, the creation of new court positions that dilute the existing ones. Each measure arrives like a stone dropped into still water, and the circles spread. In August 1648, the Parlement refuses. More than that, it issues a document, the Déclaration des Droits, demanding limits on royal power. It is not a revolution, not yet, but it is the sound of something cracking. Mazarin's response is to arrest the most vocal of the parliamentary leaders. 3 men, taken quietly, on a day when the streets of Paris happen to be full of people celebrating a military victory. The streets erupt. Barricades go up across the city overnight, over 1,000 of them, built from paving stones and overturned carts and whatever else the Parisians can drag into the streets. The word for what is happening comes from a children's game, the Fronde, a slingshot used by boys to fling stones at passing carriages. It is meant mockingly, dismissively. These are just rabble, just slingers. The name sticks, and the Fronde, as it will be known to history, turns out to be neither dismissible nor brief. For a time, Mazarin negotiates. He releases the arrested men. He makes concessions. A temporary peace settles over Paris, like ice over a river, solid-seeming but fragile, and everyone knows it. Then, in January 1649, the ice breaks. On the night of January 5th, Mazarin makes a decision. They will leave. Not openly, not with the ceremony and procession that a royal departure would normally require, but quietly, in the dark, before the city wakes. Anne is informed. The servants who need to know are told. A carriage is prepared. Someone shakes a 10-year-old boy awake. Louis later wrote about this night, or at least the memory of it surfaces in accounts of his character and his reign as a wound that never fully closed. The specific details are not all documented with precision, but this much is known. The child king was removed from his bed in the Palais Royal in the dead of night and bundled into a carriage with his mother, his brother Philippe, and a small retinue, and driven out of Paris while the city slept around him. He pretended to be asleep through most of it. Whether this was composure or shock, or simply the self-protective instinct of a child who had already learned that showing fear was not permitted, no one can say for certain. What is certain is what he saw in the months that followed. The royal family moves from chateau to chateau, Saint-Germain-en-Laye, then other residences, often in conditions that fall well short of royal comfort. Saint-Germain-en-Laye in January is cold. There are reports of insufficient furniture, inadequate heating, courtiers sleeping on straw. The great nobles, who might have been expected to rally to their king instead, begin their own phase of the Fronde, the Fronde des Princes, a more aristocratic rebellion that turns the conflict from a legal dispute into something closer to civil war. The Prince de Condé, one of France's greatest military commanders, takes up arms against the crown he is supposed to serve. Louis watches all of it. He watches nobles who bow before him in the morning scheme against him in the afternoon. He watches Mazarin, tireless, unrattled, playing faction against faction with the patience of a man who understands that most political crises resolve themselves if you simply outlast them. Maneuver through the chaos with a coolness that the boy finds both instructive and slightly frightening. He watches his mother, who loves him fiercely and rules with real capability, nevertheless depend on Mazarin for everything that matters. He watches and he records and he does not forget. The Fronde finally collapses in 1653. Mazarin outplays the nobles, one by one, until there is no coalition left to sustain the rebellion. The royal family returns to Paris. The city receives them with cheers. Paris is nothing if not capable of enthusiasm in multiple directions, and the crisis is declared over. But something has changed in the boy who rides back into the capital. He has learned what it means to be powerless in fact while powerful in name. He has felt the cold of a January exile. He has seen great men betray their king and small arrangements collapse into chaos. He has understood, at an age when most children are learning arithmetic, that power is not a possession. It is something you must build, carefully, deliberately, so that no one can ever take it from you in the night. He is 14 years old. He has already decided what kind of king he will be. The question is whether anyone around him has noticed yet. Chapter 4. The Education of a Son. There is no single classroom in which Louis XIV is made. No one moment where the boy becomes the king, no dramatic revelation that reshapes everything. It happens the way most important things happen, gradually, across years, through the accumulation of small lessons that only reveal their pattern in retrospect. Mazarin is his primary teacher, though not in any formal sense. He does not sit with Louis over books. He does not lecture. What he does, with extraordinary consistency across the years of Louis's adolescence, is include him. Council meetings, diplomatic audiences, the long and intricate negotiations that constitute the actual work of governing a kingdom. Louis is present for all of it, seated quietly at the edge of things, watching. Mazarin answers his questions seriously, without condescension. He treats the young king's curiosity as something worth cultivating, rather than something to be managed. This is, in its way, a profound gift. Louis absorbs the cardinal's methods the way a musician absorbs rhythm, not through analysis, but through sustained exposure. He learns that most political problems are not solved, but dissolved, worn down by patience and time and the careful application of pressure in the right places. He learns that information is currency, and that the man who knows most about what others want holds a quiet advantage in every room he enters. He learns that dignity, the appearance of unhurried certainty, is itself a form of power. The more formal aspects of his education are handled by others. His tutor, Nicolas de Villeroy, ensures that Louis can read, write, and conduct himself in Latin, Spanish, and Italian with varying degrees of fluency. History is taught not as scholarship, but as a practical map. Here is what happened when a king trusted the wrong man. Here is what became of a treasury left unexamined. Here is a war that began over a word. The lessons are concrete and pointed, but it is dancing that reveals him most clearly. In the ballrooms and theaters of the French court, Louis XIV discovers something he cannot find anywhere else in his carefully managed life: genuine mastery. He practices with a dedication that surprises even those accustomed to watching him. He has natural grace, a musician's sense of timing, and a body that responds to discipline with visible pleasure. At 14, he dances leading roles in court ballets. At 15, the compliments are not merely polite. At 17, when he takes the role of Apollo in a production that the court still talks about years later, there is a moment, by all accounts, of complete and unself-conscious authority. The audience stills. The king moves. Nothing else exists. He understands in that stillness exactly what he wants the rest of his life to feel like. And then comes Marie Mancini. She is Mazarin's niece, one of several Italian nieces the cardinal has brought to the French court, beautiful and well-positioned and carefully watched. Marie is different from her sisters. She is dark-haired, quick-minded, a reader of books and a talker of ideas, less concerned with the codes of court behavior than with the substance of things. Louis, who has spent his entire life inside an elaborate performance, finds her company startling. She speaks to him as though he is a person. He falls in love with something approaching desperation. For 2 years, between roughly 1658 and 1660, Louis XIV, the Sun King in the making, the absolute monarch of legend, is a lovesick young man writing letters and seeking company and experiencing, perhaps for the first time in his life, the disorienting sensation of wanting something more than he wants his own dignity. He speaks of marrying her. He is serious. Whatever the court whispers behind its fans, he is entirely serious. Mazarin refuses, gently, firmly, without cruelty, and with the pragmatism of a man who has always known this conversation was coming. Marie Mancini is not a princess. France needs a royal marriage. Spain needs to be appeased. The war that has run through Louis's entire childhood needs an ending, and endings of that kind are sealed not with letters, but with rings. Louis submits. He submits the way a man submits to something he cannot change, completely, and with a kind of internal silence that those who know him find more affecting than any outward display of grief would have been. He says goodbye to Marie Mancini at the edge of a road outside Saint-Jean-de-Luz. She weeps. He does not. Or if he does, no record of it survives. What survives is the choice itself, and what it cost, and what, perhaps, it quietly closed in him. The wedding is 6 weeks away. Chapter 5. The Marriage That Was Not a Marriage. June 9th, 1660, Saint-Jean-de-Luz, on the southwestern coast of France. The town has been preparing for weeks. Tapestries hang from every window. The streets are swept and decorated and crowded with people who have traveled from across the Basque Country to witness something they will describe to their grandchildren. The marriage of the King of France to the Infanta of Spain, sealed on the border between two kingdoms that have spent a generation trying to destroy each other. The sun is bright. The bells are loud. Everything, by every available measure, is magnificent. Louis XIV stands at the altar in cloth of gold and looks at the woman who will be his wife. Maria Theresa of Austria is 21 years old, the daughter of Philip IV of Spain, and she has spent her entire life inside the ceremonial rigidity of the Spanish Habsburg court. A world so governed by protocol that even its warmth comes formatted and prescribed. She is fair-skinned, pale-eyed, small in stature. She speaks almost no French. She has been told what this marriage means, what it requires of her, what France expects. She has agreed to all of it with the docile courage of a woman who has never been offered a different choice. She loves Louis almost immediately. This is not perhaps what either of them expected. Diplomatic marriages of this kind are arrangements, useful fictions maintained with courtesy and mutual restraint. Feeling is beside the point. But Maria Theresa, whatever her limitations as a political player, is a woman of genuine and uncomplicated emotion, and something in Louis, his physical grace perhaps, or simply the relief of being near someone who asks nothing complicated of her, captures her sincerely and entirely. Louis is kind to her. This is documented, and it matters. He could have been indifferent or cruel, and he is neither. He treats her with the careful consideration of a man who understands that she has given up everything familiar and arrived in a foreign country to serve a purpose she had no hand in choosing. He is attentive in the early years. He is present. He is, by the standards of 17th century royal marriage, reasonably generous. But he does not love her, not in the way she loves him, not with that quality of attention that makes another person feel like the fixed point of your world. Louis's attention, the full, unguarded, wanting attention that he briefly gave to Marie Mancini, has been placed somewhere it cannot be reached by a diplomatic arrangement, however golden the ceremony. He has closed a door. Maria Theresa stands in the corridor outside it, cheerful and devoted, and entirely unaware that the door exists. They will have 6 children together. 5 will die in infancy or early childhood, a grief that falls primarily on Maria Theresa, who mourns each one with open and uncontained emotion, while Louis receives the news with the composed sorrow of a man who has taught himself not to be undone by things he cannot control. Only one child survives to adulthood, Louis, known as the Grand Dauphin, born in 1661. He will outlive his mother and predeceased his father, which is a particular cruelty the story will return to in its own time. In the early years of the marriage, while Louis is still in his 20s and the court of France is at its most brilliantly energetic, he takes his first official mistress, Louise de la Vallière, a shy and genuinely gentle young woman who becomes, by most accounts, sincerely attached to him. Louise is not a schemer. She is not politically ambitious. She cries easily and loves Louis with an honesty that the court finds almost embarrassing in its lack of calculation. He is fond of her. He is also, within a few years, drifting. What follows is a pattern that will repeat itself across the decades of his reign. Affection deepens into habit. Habit thins into distance. A new presence arrives at court, more vivid, more challenging, more interesting. And Louis's attention, that great and restless instrument, redirects itself. Louise de la Vallière is eventually replaced, in the formal sense, by Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart, the Marquise de Montespan. Where Louise is gentle, Montespan is magnificent, witty, sharp-tongued, beautiful, in a way that fills a room, possessed of an intelligence that can hold Louis's interest through an entire evening without repetition. She becomes the dominant figure of his middle years. She also gives him 7 children, several of whom he legitimizes and incorporates into the life of the court. Maria Theresa knows. Of course she knows. The court of Versailles is not a place where things remain private for long. She endures the mistresses with a dignified resignation that several contemporaries describe with something close to admiration. She does not rage. She does not scheme against her rivals. She attends the ceremonies, sits at the correct distance from the king, says her prayers, and continues to love him with a steadiness that nothing quite extinguishes. She dies in July 1683, suddenly of an abscess that her doctors mishandle at the age of 44. Louis is at her bedside. Her last words, by several accounts, were an expression of gratitude that this was the first time in her life that she had experienced real pain. It is an extraordinary thing for a queen to say, and Louis, who has spent 23 years maintaining a careful and courteous distance, is said to have wept at her bedside in a way that surprises the court. Perhaps what he mourns is not only her. Perhaps he mourns the life she represented, the quiet, uncomplicated devotion that he received faithfully for decades and never quite knew what to do with. She is buried at Saint-Denis, among the kings and queens of France, and before the year is out, Louis will be secretly married again to a woman utterly unlike anyone who has come before. But that is a story for another hour, another chapter, another quiet turn of the night. Chapter 6. I Shall Be My Own Minister, March 9th, 1661. The Château de Vincennes, east of Paris. Cardinal Jules Mazarin is dying, and he knows it. He has known it for weeks, the breathlessness, the swollen legs, the way the light in the room seems to arrive from further and further away. He is 58 years old, which is not ancient, but governing France has cost him in ways that don't appear in any treasury report. He has spent the last 2 decades managing a kingdom, a queen, a rebellion, and a king in training simultaneously, and the body eventually presents its accounting. Louis comes to sit with him in these final days. He is 22 years old. He sits at the bedside of the only man who has ever truly taught him anything about power and tries to absorb whatever remains to be absorbed. What they say to each other in those hours is not fully recorded. What is recorded is that Louis is present, attentive, quiet, there. On March 9th, at 2 in the morning, Mazarin dies. The court waits. This is the moment everyone has been anticipating, in one form or another, since Louis first showed signs of actual intelligence beneath the ceremonial exterior. Mazarin is gone. The position of chief minister, the great administrative engine that has driven France since Richelieu invented it and Mazarin perfected it, is vacant. Every ambitious man at court has a candidate. Several ambitious men have already begun drafting arguments for their own appointment. Louis calls his ministers together the following morning. He looks at them, the Archbishop of Reims, the secretaries of state, the men who have grown comfortable inside the machinery of Mazarin's administration. And he tells them, with a quietness that the room apparently finds more startling than any raised voice would have been, that he has decided to govern France himself. There will be no chief minister, no cardinal, no proxy, no administrative buffer between the king and the business of the kingdom. From this morning forward, he will review all dispatches personally. He will make all final decisions himself. When they have something to communicate to the government of France, they will communicate it directly to him. He is 22 years old. The court does not believe him. This is understandable. He has spent his entire visible life being managed by Anne, by Mazarin, by the governors and tutors and ceremonial handlers who have produced this polished, graceful, composed young man for public consumption. The assumption, shared by almost everyone, is that the composure is the entirety of the man, that beneath the performance there is simply more performance. They are wrong. What Mazarin had understood, and what the court has not yet fully grasped, is that those silent years of observation produced something real. Louis has been watching how power works since before he could name what he was watching. He has seen it mishandled, in the chaos of the Fronde, in the dependency of regency, in the vulnerability of a crown that governs through intermediaries. He has decided, in the wordless way that some decisions are made, that he will never be that vulnerable again. Within weeks, he arrests Nicolas Fouquet, the finance minister who has grown so comfortable in his own power that he built himself a palace magnificent enough to make the king feel diminished. The message is clean and immediate. No one, regardless of talent or proximity, is above the reach of the crown. The court adjusts, slowly, then completely. And Louis XIV, not the child carried out of Paris in the dark, not the lovesick young man at a road outside Saint-Jean-de-Luz, but something new, something decided, begins at last to govern. Somewhere nearby, a palace is waiting to be built, and he already knows exactly what it will look like. Chapter 7. Colbert and the Machine Spring, 1661, Paris, and the expanding corridors of a reorganizing state. Jean-Baptiste Colbert arrives at the center of French power the way most truly consequential men arrive, not with fanfare, but with paperwork. He is 42 years old, square-faced and serious, a man whose idea of pleasure is a well-organized ledger, and whose idea of danger is a treasury no one has examined closely in 3 years. He has been working in Mazarin's administration for over a decade, quietly and effectively, in the way that capable administrators work when they understand that visibility is not the same as usefulness. Louis notices him almost immediately. This is itself significant. Louis XIV, in the first months of his personal rule, is sorting through the machinery of the French state the way a new owner walks through an inherited property, opening doors, testing foundations, noting what has been neglected and what has been allowed to quietly rot. What he finds in Colbert is something rare, a man who is neither charming nor ambitious in any social sense, who has no interest in the theater of court life and every interest in the actual mechanisms of government, a man who, when given a problem, solves it. Louis gives him France, not all at once, and not with that title. Colbert's formal positions accumulate gradually: Controller General of Finances in 1665, Secretary of State for the Navy in 1669, and various other portfolios that expand his reach across the decade. But the relationship that develops between the king and his minister is something more than an administrative arrangement. It is a collaboration, unequal, always, in the way that all relationships between kings and their servants are unequal, but genuine. Louis reads Colbert's reports. He argues with him. He overrules him. He also, more often than the legend of absolute monarchy might suggest, listens. What Colbert finds when he begins examining the French finances is, by any measure, alarming. The tax system is a labyrinth built over centuries of compromise and improvisation. Direct taxes, the tile, levied primarily on the peasantry, pass through so many intermediate hands before reaching the treasury that a significant portion simply disappears along the way. Indirect taxes are farmed out to private collectors who take their commission before forwarding anything to the crown. The nobility, by ancient arrangement, pays nothing. The clergy contributes a voluntary gift, the don gratuit, that it negotiates on its own terms. The burden falls, as it has always fallen, on those least able to carry it. Colbert cannot dismantle this entirely. The political cost would be ruinous. But he rationalizes it. He reduces the number of tax farmers, increases oversight, tightens the accounting. He attacks the national debt with the controlled aggression of a man who finds disorder personally offensive. Within a few years, the deficit that threatened to swallow the French state has been substantially reduced. It is not a miracle. It is administration, applied with relentless consistency. and then he builds. Colbert's ambition for France extends well beyond the correction of its balance sheets. He believes, with a conviction that borders on the theological, that national greatness is manufactured, that a kingdom becomes powerful not by accident or divine favor, but through deliberate investment in the things that produce lasting strength. He establishes the Royal Academy of Sciences in 1666, the Academy of Architecture in 1671, restructures the Academy of Painting and Sculpture that Louis XIII had founded and allowed to languish. He builds up the French navy from near collapse into a force capable of challenging England and the Dutch Republic on open water. He promotes French manufacturing through mercantilist policies designed to keep money inside the kingdom and reduce dependence on foreign goods. He also, with slightly less visible enthusiasm, funds Versailles. This is where the collaboration becomes complicated. Colbert understands, as a matter of political logic, why the palace must be built. The concentration of the nobility at court, the projection of royal magnificence, the transformation of France into the cultural center of Europe are all policies with real strategic value. He does not dispute the argument. What he disputes, in memoranda that become increasingly pointed as the construction proceeds, is the cost. The numbers that pass across his desk in the 1670s are staggering. Millions of livres flowing into fountains and marble floors and gilded ceilings while the treasury absorbs the pressure and the peasants absorb the taxation. He says so, repeatedly, in writing. Louis receives these memoranda, notes their contents, and continues building. This is perhaps the most honest portrait of their relationship. Colbert provides the reality. Louis decides what to do with it. The king is not ignorant of the costs. He is simply willing to pay them, or more precisely, willing to have France pay them, in exchange for something he values more than fiscal prudence. Colbert dies in 1683, exhausted, and by some accounts aware that much of what he built is already being spent faster than he built it. He leaves behind a navy, a set of institutions, and a France considerably more organized than the one he found. Louis attends to other things. The palace, after all, is nearly finished. Chapter 8. The Gilded Cage, 1661–1682. The plains southwest of Paris, where a hunting lodge becomes something else entirely. Louis XIV's father had a small chateau at Versailles, a modest thing by royal standards, built for hunting and brief retreats, surrounded by marshland and woodland, and the particular quiet of a place that expects nothing of you. Louis XV loved it for exactly that reason. It asked him nothing. It had no history, no grandeur, no accumulated weight of ceremony and expectation. It was simply a place to breathe. His son looks at it and sees something else entirely. The decision to transform Versailles into the permanent seat of French royal power is not made in a single moment. It develops across 2 decades, through the early building campaigns of the 1660s, through the great expansion of the 1670s, overseen by the architect Jules Hardouin-Mansart, through the construction of the Hall of Mirrors, begun in 1678, accumulating intention by intention until what was once a hunting lodge becomes a city unto itself, housing thousands of courtiers, servants, officials, and guards within its gilded walls and geometric gardens. The stated reason is magnificence. France is the greatest kingdom in Europe, and its palace must say so plainly to every ambassador who passes through its gates. This is true, and Louis believes it sincerely. But there is another reason, quieter, more precise. He needs the nobles where he can see them. The memory of the Fronde has never left him. Those years of cold chateau and humiliating dependency of great men who bowed before him in the morning and conspired against him by afternoon. The nobility of France has a long and productive history of rebellion, of leveraging their regional power bases and their private armies and their ancient privileges into challenges against the crown. Louis has studied this history the way a general studies the terrain before a battle. He knows exactly where the danger comes from. His solution is elegant and devastating in equal measure. Beginning in the 1670s and consolidating through the 1680s, Louis makes Versailles not merely attractive to the French nobility, but functionally necessary. Favor, royal appointments, military commissions, the pensions and privileges that constitute the actual economic lifeblood of the aristocratic class, flows from the king, and the king is at Versailles. To be away from Versailles is to be away from the source. It is to become invisible, and in a world where visibility is currency, invisibility is ruin. The great nobles come. They build apartments within the palace complex, or secure the ones already built, and they arrange their entire lives around the rhythms of the royal day. They attend the lever, the elaborate morning ceremony in which Louis XIV rises, dresses, and prepares to face the world before an audience of courtiers ranked by precedence. They attend the caucher, the reverse ceremony at night, equally choreographed, equally observed. They compete with a seriousness that might strike a later age as comic, for the honor of handing the king his shirt, of holding his candlestick, of being present at the particular moment when the most powerful man in Europe puts on his left shoe. It works. Brilliantly, systematically, completely. The nobles who once commanded armies in their own provinces are now arguing over seating arrangements at dinner. The men whose grandfathers raised private rebellions are now spending their fortunes on court fashion, on gambling debts incurred at Versailles card tables, on the endless and expensive performance of aristocratic relevance. They are not imprisoned in any legal sense. They can leave, but leaving means losing, and they know it. Louis watches all of this with satisfaction. What he does not fully account for, what perhaps cannot be fully accounted for until you are inside it, is what the system costs him. The ceremonies that imprison the nobility also govern the king. His day, from the moment he opens his eyes to the moment he closes them, belongs to the ritual. He cannot eat without an audience. He cannot walk in his gardens without a procession forming behind him. He cannot be ill or tired or uncertain or simply human without the entire carefully constructed apparatus of royal authority trembling slightly at its foundations. The performance must be sustained every day, without interruption, for decades. Saint-Simon, the sharp-eyed duke, whose diaries preserve Versailles with the precision of a naturalist cataloging a strange ecosystem, writes that Louis noticed everyone, that not a face in any room escaped his attention, not a courtier who came or failed to come went unregistered. This is presented as evidence of royal mastery. It is also, if you look at it differently, an extraordinary amount of work. The Sun King and his gilded prisoners gaze at each other across the marble corridors of Versailles, each dependent on the other's presence, each performing for the other's benefit. Neither is entirely free. And yet, from the outside, from the courts of Europe that watch and envy and imitate, it looks quite simply like the most magnificent thing in the world. Chapter 9. The Art of Being Watched. Versailles, the 1680s, the palace at its height. Every morning, at precisely 8 o'clock, a first gentleman of the bedchamber opens the door to the king's private apartments and speaks a single phrase into the darkness. "Sire, it is time." What follows is not a man waking up. It is a performance beginning. The lever, the ceremonial rising of Louis XIV, unfolds in carefully graduated stages, each with its own cast of participants admitted in strict order of rank. The first entry belongs to the royal physicians and surgeons, who examine the king and confirm that the sun, so to speak, will rise today. Then come the princes of the blood, the grand officers of the household, the first gentlemen. Then a wider circle, the dukes, the marshals, the favored courtiers, who have earned or inherited or maneuvered their way into proximity. Each wave admitted through a door that opens and closes with the precision of a stage curtain. Louis dresses before all of them. He submits to the ritual of his own toilette as a public act, the shirt handed by the highest-ranking nobleman present, the wig adjusted with practiced care, the coat, the orders of chivalry, the sword. He does not dress in private and then appear. He appears in order to dress. The distinction matters enormously. The act of dressing, in this context, is not preparation for the day. It is the day's first statement. By the time Louis XIV steps out of his private apartments and into the Hall of Mirrors, he is already several hours into governing. He understands something that most rulers of his era only partially grasp, that political power, at its most sophisticated, does not reside in armies or treasuries or even in law. It resides in the imagination of the people who encounter it. A king who is seen to be magnificent is magnificent. A king who is seen to be ordinary becomes, eventually, ordinary. The image is not the decoration of power. The image is the mechanism. And Louis XIV is, among all his other qualities and contradictions, a man of genuine aesthetic intelligence. This is not a small thing. He does not deploy the arts of Versailles merely as propaganda in the crude sense. Look here. Observe how great I am. Be impressed and submit. What he builds is more total than that, more immersive, more psychologically complete. Every element of the palace, from the geometry of Lenotre's gardens to the iconography of Lebrun's ceiling paintings, participates in a single coherent argument about the nature of royal authority. The gardens do not merely look ordered. They embody the proposition that nature itself submits to the will of the king. The Hall of Mirrors does not merely reflect light. It places every visitor inside a gallery of French military victories, surrounded by the king's face, walking toward the king's throne, unable to look anywhere without receiving the message. The sun is everywhere. Apollo, god of light, of reason, of the arts, of the orderly progression of day, appears throughout the palace in paint and marble and gold. The fountain of Apollo in the garden shows the god rising in his chariot from the waters, horses rearing, the whole composition caught in a moment of ascent. It is not subtle. It is not meant to be. Louis XIV understands that symbols work through repetition, through saturation, through the slow accumulation of images that eventually stop being images and start being assumptions. He had begun building this language of the self long before Versailles was finished. In his youth, in those years of careful adolescent formation that the previous chapters traced, he had danced. And dancing was not, in the France of the 17th century, a private pleasure or a social grace. It was a public art form performed before courts and diplomats and audiences who understood perfectly well that the king's body, moving in perfect command of music and space and time, was itself a political statement. In 1653, at the age of 14, Louis danced the role of the rising sun in Le Ballet de la Nuit, a production that began at nightfall and ended at dawn, with Louis appearing in the final act as Apollo himself, flooding the stage with light. He was 14. He was already fluent in what he was doing. He continues performing in court ballets until his 30s, longer than most kings would consider dignified, because Louis has understood something that dignity-conscious kings miss entirely. The body that moves with authority before an audience of hundreds teaches that audience something they cannot be told. It demonstrates control. It demonstrates health, vitality, the physical confidence of a man who inhabits his own skin without apology. Later, as age makes dancing impossible, he turns to riding, appearing on horseback in equestrian portraits and military reviews with the same careful attention to how the image lands. The portrait by Hyacinthe Rigaud, painted in 1701, when Louis is 62 years old, assembles the entire argument into a single frame. The king stands in his coronation robes, one hand on his hip, the other resting on a scepter. His left leg is turned outward in a dancer's pose, still after all these decades, the pose of a man trained in movement and authority. The face is aging but composed. The ermine and the fleur-de-lis consume the canvas. The column, the drape, the throne behind him, everything recedes to make the figure of the king the only possible center of attention. It is one of the most effective images of power ever made. Louis knows it. He commissions copies. He sends them to courts across Europe. The image travels further than any army. But there is a dimension to all of this that the portraits do not capture, and that Saint-Simon, alone among the chroniclers of Versailles, catches with his acid precision. Louis watches back, not only during the lever and the coucher, through everything. Through the promenades in the garden, through the evening entertainments, through the dinners where the king eats publicly and the court stands in attendance. He notes who is present and who is absent. He notes who speaks to whom, who avoids whose eyes, who laughs too loudly and who is too carefully quiet. He has built a system of total visibility and then stationed himself at its center as both the observed and the observer. The courtiers perform for him. He performs for the courtiers. Everyone in every room is both audience and actor. It is an extraordinary achievement of political theater. It is also, if you allow yourself to feel the weight of it, an almost airless way to live. 35 years of this. Every morning the door opens at 8. Every morning the same phrase falls into the same darkness. Every morning Louis XIV assembles himself, piece by piece, before the eyes of men competing for the right to hand him his shirt. And every morning he does it without visible complaint, because the performance by now is not something he does. It is something he is. Outside in the garden, Apollo rises from his fountain. The horses rear. The water catches the light. The sun, as always, is on time. Chapter 10. Wars of Glory, Wars of Cost. Spring 1667. The Spanish Netherlands and the opening moves of a very long game. Louis XIV rides at the head of his army with the practiced ease of a man who has spent years preparing for exactly this moment. He is 28 years old. He is, by every visible measure, at the height of his powers, healthy, confident, surrounded by the most capable military commanders in Europe, backed by a treasury that Colbert has spent 6 years painstakingly repairing. The army that moves with him into the Spanish Netherlands is the largest and best equipped France has fielded in a generation. The roads are dry. The season is favorable. Everything is arranged. He has been waiting for this. The pretext is legal, as pretexts often are. When his father-in-law Philip IV of Spain died in 1665, Louis argued that certain territories in the Spanish Netherlands should devolve to his wife Maria Theresa under local inheritance law. the droit de dévolution, since the Spanish had never paid the dowry promised at their marriage. It is a lawyer's argument dressed in military clothing. But the argument is almost beside the point. What Louis wants, what he has always wanted since those cold years of the Fronde, when France felt fragile and diminished, is to demonstrate beyond any possible doubt that France is the preeminent power in Europe, that the age of Habsburg dominance is finished, that the Sun King, in his personal rule, will not merely maintain what he inherited, but expand it. The War of Devolution goes well, too well, in a certain sense. French forces move through the Spanish Netherlands with a speed that alarms not only Spain, but the Dutch Republic, England, and Sweden, who form a triple alliance in early 1668 and pressure Louis into the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. He acquires a string of fortified towns along the northern border of France, including Lille. It is a solid strategic gain. But the speed with which the alliance assembled against him lodges itself in his mind. The Dutch, in particular, irritate him. The Dutch Republic is everything Louis XIV instinctively dislikes. It is a republic, governed not by divine right, but by merchants and committees. It is Protestant. It is prosperous in ways that do not depend on royal patronage or aristocratic structure. And it has had the audacity, in forming the Triple Alliance, to check a French king who considered his campaign essentially his own business. Louis does not forget this either. He begins planning almost immediately. The Franco-Dutch War opens in the spring of 1672. Louis crosses the Rhine, an event he orders commemorated in paint and poetry and sculpture as one of the great moments of his reign. The king on horseback at the water's edge, France pouring across into enemy territory. The early campaign is devastating. Dutch cities fall. The Republic teeters. William III of Orange, young and tenacious, assumes emergency powers and begins the long work of holding his country together through a combination of military stubbornness and diplomatic genius. He opens the dikes. The Dutch flood their own land, a decision of extraordinary, almost incomprehensible will, destroying crops and property and the accumulated work of generations to stop the French advance. It works. The campaign bogs down. The war expands as Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and Brandenburg join against France. What began as a punitive expedition against an irritating republic becomes a 6-year continental struggle that exhausts every party involved. France emerges from the Peace of Nijmegen in 1678 with territorial gains, Franche-Comté and further border towns, and Louis is celebrated in the language of his court as the greatest king in Europe, the architect of a new French supremacy. The language is not entirely wrong. France is powerful. The army that Louvois has built and Louis has funded is a genuine force, professional and well-supplied in ways that most European armies are not. The military engineer Vauban has constructed a ring of fortifications along France's eastern border that represent some of the most sophisticated defensive architecture in the world. But Colbert's memoranda are growing more urgent. The numbers are frightening. And Louis, receiving them in Versailles between hunts and ballets and the ongoing theater of his court, continues to spend. The 9 Years' War, which begins in 1688 and will prove to be something different in character from everything that came before, opens when Louis moves troops into the Palatinate, a German territory whose succession he disputes. What he expects is a quick resolution. What arrives is a coalition more united and more determined than any he has previously faced. William III, now William III of England as well, having taken the English throne in the Glorious Revolution, organizes the Grand Alliance: England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, Savoy, and others. It is, in effect, most of Europe arranged against France. The war runs from 1688 to 1697. It is 9 years of attritional conflict, sieges and counter-sieges, campaigns that advance and retreat across the same scarred ground, the slow grinding expenditure of men and money, and the particular morale that comes from believing you are winning. France holds. Louis's armies, though never achieving the decisive victories of the earlier wars, prevent the coalition from breaking through. The Peace of Ryswick in 1697 ends the conflict, but on terms that require Louis to return most of what he has taken since 1678 and to recognize William III as the legitimate King of England, a recognition that costs him something harder to measure than territory. He has been contained, not defeated, not humiliated in any final sense. But the Europe of 1697 is different from the Europe of 1672. The other powers have learned, through 3 decades of costly experience, that French expansion can be checked if they act in concert. William III has understood this longer than anyone, and his patient, persistent construction of coalitions against Louis is one of the great strategic achievements of the era. He and Louis XIV are the twin poles of European politics for 30 years, one building his power through spectacle and force, the other building his through patience and alliance, and the friction between them shapes the continent. There is something else. Colbert is gone by now, dead in 1683, his warnings unheeded in the end. His successors manage the finances with less independence and less ability to say no. The peasantry of France is taxed beyond anything the system was designed to sustain. The winter of 1693–94 brings crop failures and famine that kill hundreds of thousands. Estimates vary, but the scale of the suffering is not disputed. Louis, insulated inside Versailles, receives the reports with the sorrow of a man who is genuinely troubled by what is happening but has not yet connected it to the specific decisions he has made and continues to make. Vauban, the great military engineer, perhaps the most practically intelligent man in Louis's entire service, writes a document in this period that cuts to the heart of the contradiction. He surveys the actual condition of the French population, region by region, and produces figures that argue plainly that the pursuit of military glory has produced widespread misery for the people the king is supposed to protect. He calls for tax reform, for a more equitable system that reaches the nobility and the clergy as well as the peasantry. Louis receives the document, suppresses it, and does not act on it. Vauban dies in 1707, disappointed. The wars, in the end, accomplish something real. France's borders are more defensible. Its military institutions are modern and capable. Its prestige, even after the reversals of Ryswick, remains formidable. These are not nothing, but they are purchased at a price that does not appear in any of the triumphal ceiling paintings at Versailles. In the hunger of a French winter, in the emptied villages, in the slow and patient coalition that William III builds from the rubble of every French campaign, in the treasury that will never quite recover. Louis rides home from his campaigns through towns that cheer him because cheering is the safest response. In Versailles, the fountains still run. Apollo still rises. The Hall of Mirrors catches the afternoon light and holds it, golden and complete, while outside the windows, the long shadow of 3 wars stretches across a countryside that is paying quietly and without ceremony for everything the mirror reflects. Chapter 11. The Revocation, October 18, 1685. The Château de Fontainebleau, southeast of Paris. The document is ready before breakfast. It has been prepared with the thoroughness that characterizes all official acts of this reign, the language precise, the legal architecture sound. the theological justification woven through every clause. Louis XIV signs it in the morning, in the same hand that has signed treaties and declarations and military orders across 24 years of personal rule. He signs it without visible hesitation. He believes, with a completeness that admits no shadow of doubt, that he is doing the right thing. The Edict of Fontainebleau revokes the Edict of Nantes. What this means, in practical terms, is total. The Edict of Nantes, issued by Louis's grandfather Henry IV in 1598, after decades of catastrophic religious civil war, had granted French Protestants, the Huguenots, the right to worship, to educate their children, to hold public office, to exist within the kingdom with something approaching legal equality. It was not a generous document by modern standards, and it had been eroded steadily across the intervening decades, but it was a foundation, a floor below which the state had agreed not to push them. That floor is gone now. Protestant churches will be demolished. Protestant schools will close. Protestant clergy must leave France within 15 days or convert to Catholicism. Protestant children will be baptized and raised in the Catholic faith by order of the state. Protestant marriages will be invalid. Protestant assemblies will be illegal. And emigration, the logical response of anyone whose entire civic existence has just been extinguished, is explicitly forbidden. Louis does not consider this persecution. He considers it clarity. His understanding of his own authority is, by this point in his reign, total and genuinely believed rather than merely performed. He is God's representative on earth. God's kingdom, as he understands it, is Catholic. A kingdom divided in its faith is a kingdom weakened in its foundation. He has believed this since his mother pressed it into him in childhood. And 62 years of living inside the assumption has given it the quality of bedrock. He looks at the Huguenots and sees not citizens exercising a legitimate faith, but a fissure in the unity he has spent his entire reign constructing. He has also been moving toward this moment for years. The Dragonnades, a policy of billeting soldiers in Huguenot households, with the soldiers encouraged to make themselves as unpleasant as possible without quite crossing into officially sanctioned violence, have been intensifying since the early 1680s. The results, reported back to Versailles as mass conversions, are in fact the product of fear and exhaustion rather than genuine religious change. The numbers look impressive in the reports. Louis reads the numbers. He does not read the households. What the Edict of Fontainebleau produces in the weeks and months that follow its signing is not the religious unity Louis imagines. It produces flight. Emigration is forbidden, but borders are not sealed with perfect efficiency, and people in genuine fear of their lives and livelihoods are resourceful. Estimates vary considerably. Historians have placed the number of Huguenots who leave France in the years following the revocation anywhere between 200,000 and 800,000. The range itself tells you something about the difficulty of counting a movement that is technically illegal and therefore largely undocumented. What is not in dispute is the composition of those who leave. They are not, for the most part, the poorest of the Huguenot community. They are merchants, manufacturers, craftsmen, physicians, military officers, financiers, printers, silk weavers, clockmakers, glass blowers, people whose skills and capital are portable and whose connections abroad make departure possible. They go to England, to the Dutch Republic, to Brandenburg, Prussia, to Switzerland, to South Africa, to anywhere that will receive them. And everywhere they go, they build. The silk industries of Spitalfields in London are substantially established by Huguenot refugees. The financial networks of Amsterdam are strengthened by them. Frederick William of Brandenburg, the great elector, issues the Edict of Potsdam within weeks of the Edict of Fontainebleau, explicitly welcoming Huguenot refugees and offering them land, tax exemptions, and religious freedom. Tens of thousands come. They bring their trades, their capital, and their considerable anger at the country that expelled them. France's rivals grow stronger on what France drives out. The military consequences are immediate and concrete. Several Huguenot officers of genuine distinction, men who had served France with loyalty across decades of war, take their expertise to enemy armies. They will appear on the other side of French lines in the 9 Years' War and the War of the Spanish Succession, commanding troops with the particular effectiveness of men who know exactly how French armies think. Within France, the response is more muted, but not absent. The Duc de Saint-Simon, who misses very little, records the unease at court, the sense among those willing to think clearly about it that something has been done that cannot be undone, that the kingdom has been diminished in ways that will not appear in any official accounting. The philosopher Pierre Bayle, writing from exile in Rotterdam, argues with quiet ferocity that conscience cannot be coerced, that a faith adopted under threat of soldiers in one's kitchen is not faith at all. Louis does not read Pierre Bayle. He receives instead the congratulations of Pope Innocent V, muted, it must be said, because the Pope and Louis are in the middle of their own dispute about the limits of royal authority over the French Church, and the Pope is not inclined toward warmth. He receives the formal approval of the French clergy, who have reasons of their own to welcome the elimination of a Protestant alternative. He receives from Madame de Maintenon, who will shortly become his secret wife, and who is deeply, genuinely pious, what appears to be quiet encouragement. He receives very little that pushes back. This is the cost of having built Versailles so effectively. The system that concentrates all favor in the king's hands also concentrates all flattery there. The nobles who might once have spoken plainly are too dependent on royal goodwill to risk honesty. The ministers who see the economic damage unfolding present their numbers carefully, without the bluntness that Colbert once permitted himself. Louis signs the document. The morning light falls through the windows of Fontainebleau. The candles are snuffed. The clerks disperse. Outside, on the roads that lead to every border France possesses, people are already beginning to pack. Chapter 12. Madame de Maintenon, Versailles, 1683. The palace in the quiet after a death. Maria Theresa dies on July 30th, quickly and badly, of an abscess that her doctors treat with such confident incompetence that she is gone within days of falling ill. She is 44 years old. The court mourns with the practiced efficiency of people who have attended many funerals and know exactly what each gesture costs and what it buys. The black goes up, the candles are lit, the ceremonies proceed. Louis stands at her bedside in the final hours. Those who are present record that he weeps genuinely without performance, in a way that surprises a court accustomed to reading his face for exactly this kind of information. He says afterward something that becomes one of the more quietly devastating things attributed to him across a long reign full of quotable pronouncements. He says that this is the first sorrow she has ever caused him. The court receives this in silence. There is no charitable interpretation that does not also contain a reproach, not to Maria Theresa, who caused him nothing, but to the 33 years of careful, courteous distance that made her grief-free presence in his life possible. She had loved him completely, and he had received that love the way a house receives warmth, gratefully, passively, without full awareness of its value until it is gone. He does not remain a widower for long. Françoise d'Aubigné, the woman who will become the Marquise de Maintenon, and by the end of 1683, the secret wife of the King of France, arrives in his life not as a sudden entrance, but as a gradual, almost imperceptible deepening. She has been at court for years, first as the governess of Louis's legitimized children by Madame de Montespan, then as a presence in his daily orbit that grows steadily more necessary without anyone quite being able to pinpoint the moment it becomes indispensable. Her origins are extraordinary, and she knows it, and she has spent her life navigating the gap between where she came from and where she has arrived. She was born in 1635 in a prison in Niort. Her father was imprisoned there, and spent portions of her childhood in genuine poverty, raised partly by a Calvinist aunt and partly by a Catholic godmother, converted back and forth between faiths with the helplessness of a child whose religious identity depends entirely on which adult is currently responsible for her. She eventually marries the poet Paul Scarron, much older, disabled, brilliant, and spends years as his caretaker and the witty, resourceful hostess of a modest Parisian salon. When Scarron dies in 1660, she is 25, a widow with no money and extraordinary social intelligence. She survives. Then she rises. By the time she enters Louis's inner circle, she is in her mid-40s, and she is entirely unlike anyone he has been close to before. She is not beautiful in the conventional court sense. She is handsome, composed, possessed of a stillness that draws attention precisely because it does not seek it. She is genuinely intelligent, not in the sparkling, combative way of Montespan, but in a deeper, more considered way, the intelligence of someone who has read widely and suffered specifically, and arrived at views that are her own rather than borrowed from fashion. She is also, by this point in her life, profoundly Catholic, not performatively, not politically, but in the quiet interior way of someone for whom faith is the actual architecture of daily existence. Louis finds this restful. He is 45 years old in 1683. He has spent his entire adult life performing for the court, for Europe, for the image that Rigaud will eventually fix in paint. What Maintenon offers him in the private hours that expand gradually through the 1680s and beyond is something close to ordinariness. She speaks to him plainly. She disagrees with him, carefully, without confrontation, but genuinely. She is not afraid of him in the way that most people at Versailles are afraid of him, because she has survived things that make royal displeasure feel relatively manageable. They marry secretly, almost certainly in late 1683 or early 1684. The exact date is not documented with certainty, which is itself a testament to how completely they managed to keep it from a court that prided itself on knowing everything. She is never officially queen. She holds no formal title beyond her marquisate. She does not appear beside him at state functions as a consort. The court knows because the court always knows, and gossips about it with the determined creativity of people who have nothing more urgent to occupy their ingenuity. But what she becomes in the private rooms of Versailles that the court cannot fully penetrate is something the court has no good word for. Companion is too slight. Advisor is too formal. She is the person to whom Louis talks at the end of the day when the performance is finally, briefly, allowed to pause. Under her influence, the late court grows measurably quieter. The elaborate entertainments of the 1670s, the ballets, the outdoor spectacles, the gambling that ran through the night, gradually subside. Religious observance deepens. The king attends Mass with a seriousness that goes beyond ceremony. Maintenon establishes Saint-Cyr, a school for impoverished girls of noble birth, in 1686, one of the most genuinely original institutions of the reign, shaped entirely by her own experience of being a girl with intelligence and no resources. She pours herself into it. It is perhaps the thing in all of Versailles that is entirely hers. Louis grows older beside her. The great wars continue beyond the windows. The treasury strains. The news from the fronts grows harder to receive gracefully. But in the evenings, in the private apartments, there is a woman who knew poverty and prison before she knew palaces, and she does not let him forget entirely what the world outside the mirrors actually contains. Chapter 13. The War That Broke the Myth. November 1st, 1700. Versailles and the arrival of a letter that changes everything. Charles II of Spain is dead. He has been dying for most of his life. The last of the Spanish Habsburgs, the product of so many generations of dynastic intermarriage, that his body simply could not sustain itself, his jaw too large for his teeth, his mind too fragile for his throne. He dies childless, as everyone has long anticipated, and in his will he leaves the entire Spanish Empire, Spain, the Spanish Netherlands, the Italian territories, the vast colonial holdings in the Americas, to Philip, Duke of Anjou. Philip is Louis XIV's grandson. Louis stands in his apartments at Versailles and reads the will. He is 62 years old. He has spent 4 decades building French power, fighting French wars, projecting French magnificence across a continent that has spent those same decades learning to fear and resent and imitate him in equal measure. And now, without a single soldier moving, without a single shot fired, the Spanish throne is being offered to his bloodline. He accepts. He knows what it will cost. He accepts anyway. The Grand Alliance assembles against him with a speed that suggests it has been waiting for exactly this moment. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, Prussia, Portugal, and Savoy united under the strategic architecture that William III spent 30 years constructing, and that survives his death in 1702 and passes into the capable hands of men like the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy. It is the most formidable coalition France has ever faced. It fights with a collective determination that transforms every campaign into something attritional and grinding and deeply, exhaustingly expensive. The war runs for 13 years. Marlborough and Eugene are extraordinary commanders, patient, flexible, willing to coordinate across national lines in ways that French generals, accustomed to the particular vanities of serving an absolute monarch, often are not. At Blenheim in 1704, at Ramillies in 1706, at Oudenarde in 1708, French armies are defeated with a decisiveness that no amount of court poetry can adequately paper over. The dispatches arrive at Versailles with the regularity of a slow hemorrhage. Louis receives them in his private apartments, reads them, and does not allow his face to change in public. In private, something is changing. The winter of 1708 to 1709 is the coldest in living memory across Europe. In France, it is catastrophic. Rivers freeze solid. Seed corn meant for spring planting is destroyed by temperatures that arrive without warning and stay without mercy. Livestock die in their fields. The harvest fails. Famine moves through the countryside with the unhurried efficiency of something that has no reason to hurry. Hundreds of thousands die. Estimates place the death toll in the hundreds of thousands. Though the precise numbers are impossible to establish with confidence, Louis does something he has never done before. He writes directly to the French people. Not through proclamation, not through the layered intermediaries of court and clergy and provincial administration, but a personal appeal, read from pulpits across France, acknowledging the suffering, asking for patience and sacrifice, explaining that the peace negotiations have failed because the terms demanded were ones no king with any self-respect could accept. He is asking, not commanding. Asking. The response, by most accounts, is genuine. France fights on. The people who are starving send what they can. There is something in this that Louis does not know how to fully process, that the country is willing to suffer alongside him, that the bond between king and people is more resilient than the machinery of absolutism ever required it to be. He has governed France as though its allegiance was guaranteed by his authority. He discovers, in the worst years of this war, that it is offered freely by people who have every reason to withhold it. The Peace of Utrecht settles the conflict in 1713. Philip remains on the Spanish throne, which is the essential thing. But France cedes territory, accepts limitations, and emerges diminished in ways that the treaty language cannot fully conceal. Louis returns to Versailles. He is 74 years old, and he is very tired, and there is almost no one left from the world in which he began. Chapter 14. The Long-Dying Versailles, 1711. The Palace in the Season of Funerals. There is a particular quality to grief that arrives in succession, not the clean, singular blow of a single loss, but the cumulative weight of one after another, each arriving before the previous one has fully settled, until the mourner begins to feel less like a person experiencing sorrow and more like a landscape being slowly reshaped by weather. Louis XIV, in the final years of his reign, learns this quality from the inside. It begins with his son, Louis de France, the Grand Dauphin, Monseigneur, the large and amiable man who has spent 50 years as the heir to the French throne without ever quite becoming a figure of historical consequence, dies on April 14th, 1711, of smallpox. He is 49 years old. He has outlived his mother, has waited his entire life for a throne that his father simply will not vacate, and dies never having ruled anything. Louis XIV mourns him with the measured grief of a man who has learned to contain his losses, but those around him note something different in his eyes in the weeks that follow, a new awareness, perhaps, of what it means to have outlived the person who was supposed to come after you. The next blow arrives barely a year later. The Duc de Bourgogne, Louis's eldest grandson, the man who has now become the new Dauphin, a prince of genuine intelligence and reforming instinct, who had begun to attract the cautious hopes of those who found the aging king's absolutism exhausting, dies in February 1712 of measles. He is 29 years old. His wife, Marie Adélaïde of Savoy, dies of the same illness 6 days before him. She is 26. They die within a week of each other, in the same bed, in the same room, attended by the same helpless physicians. The court is devastated. Marie Adélaïde had been, for many people at Versailles, the emotional center of the late reign, vivacious and warm and genuinely fond of the old king in a way that seemed mutual and unperformed. Saint-Simon, who is not given to sentiment, writes of her death with an anguish that pierces even his habitual irony. Louis himself, who has received her since childhood with something approaching paternal warmth, is seen in the days that follow in a state that those closest to him describe with careful understatement as profound. He does not collapse. He has never collapsed. But something in the architecture of his bearing shifts in ways that cannot be entirely hidden. And then the children begin to die. The Duc de Bourgogne and Marie Adélaïde have 2 young sons. The elder, the Duc de Bretagne, dies in March 1712, within weeks of his parents, possibly of the same illness, possibly of the treatments administered by physicians who do not yet understand that their remedies are often more lethal than the diseases they address. He is 5 years old. His younger brother, barely 2 years old and already designated the new Dauphin, survives, but only because his governess, the Duchesse de Ventadour, reportedly refuses to allow the doctors near him and nurses the child herself through the crisis with a ferocity that later generations would credit with saving the French monarchy from extinction. That child, Louis, the future Louis XV, is the last male heir. He is 2 years old, he is fragile, and he is now the single thread on which the Bourbon succession hangs. Louis XIV is 73 years old, and he is the last man standing of his immediate line. He has outlived his son, his grandson, his granddaughter-in-law, and his great-grandson, all in the space of 12 months. He has watched the future of France die in a sequence of sick rooms that his physicians enter with their leather bags and their confident ignorance, and exit with their explanations and their failures. He has sat with Maintenon in the private apartments and done the thing that he has always done in extremity, endured without public dissolution what would break most people entirely. But those who have access to him in this period record something new. A tiredness not of the body. He is still physically active, still hunting when his health permits, but of a different, less locatable kind. The tiredness of a man who has been performing for 70 years and who is beginning, quietly and without announcement, to wonder what the performance was for. He turns, more than ever, toward Maintenon, toward the small religious routines she has cultivated around him across 2 decades of quiet companionship, toward Saint-Cyr, where he visits and sits among the girls she has educated, in an atmosphere so entirely free of court protocol that contemporaries find it almost disorienting to observe. The Sun King, surrounded by schoolgirls, visibly at ease. He also turns toward the small Dauphin, the 2-year-old great-grandson, who is now, improbably and terrifyingly, the future. Louis spends time with him in a way that he did not, by all accounts, spend time with his own children, sitting with the boy, watching him, speaking to him with the patience of a man who understands that everything must now be transferred to this small and unknowing recipient. The court watches all of this and does not know what to do with it. Versailles was built for magnificence. It was built for the performance of invincibility. It was not built for an old man sitting quietly with a child, trying to teach him something about the weight of a name. There are no more wars to plan. The Peace of Utrecht has settled the continent into an exhausted quiet. The great rivals are gone. William III dead since 1702, Marlborough retired from command. The stage that Louis XIV commanded for 50 years has emptied around him, one figure at a time, until he stands on it largely alone. He is 76 years old, and the summer of 1715 is warm, and somewhere in his left leg something is beginning to go wrong. He does not mention it at first. He has never been someone who mentions things first. Chapter 15. The longest reign ends August 1715. Versailles and the beginning of the end. It starts as a pain in his left leg. Louis mentions it to no one for several days. This is entirely consistent with a man who has spent 76 years treating his own body as a public instrument that must not be seen to falter. He continues his routines. He attends Mass. He receives ministers. He appears at dinner in the public dining room, where the court watches him eat, as it has always watched him eat, with the attentive reverence of people for whom the king's continued existence is the organizing principle of their entire world. But the leg worsens. By mid-August, the physicians are called, which means the court knows, which means all of Versailles knows within hours. The diagnosis is gangrene, a word that falls through the gilded corridors of the palace with a weight entirely disproportionate to its two syllables. The doctors prescribe remedies, apply treatments, confer with one another in the elaborate Latin of men who are doing the best they can with what they have and who understand privately that it is not enough. The gangrene spreads. Louis receives each report of its progress with the same composure he has brought to every unwelcome dispatch of the past 50 years. He begins to put his affairs in order. On August 25th, the feast of St. Louis, his patron saint, a day he has always marked with particular observance, he asks that his 5-year-old great-grandson be brought to his bedside. The boy arrives, small and solemn, stood before the dying king by attendants who understand that they are witnessing something that will be recorded and repeated for generations. Louis looks at him for a long moment. Then he speaks. What he says is documented in various forms by multiple witnesses. The substance is consistent across the accounts. He tells the child not to imitate his love of war, that he has been too fond of it, that it has cost France too much, that a king must seek the peace of his people before the glory of his own name. He tells him to try to ease the burden on his subjects, which he himself had not always managed to do. He tells him to take God as his guide. It is a remarkable thing for this particular man to say. He has spent 72 years building the most elaborate apparatus of royal glory that Europe has ever seen. He has fought wars for territory and prestige and dynastic advantage. He has taxed his people to the edge of endurance and beyond. He has built Versailles and filled it with mirrors and placed Apollo everywhere and arranged that every morning the first thing the most powerful men in France would do is compete for the right to hand him his shirt. And now he looks at a 5-year-old and says, "Do not do what I did." The boy is taken away. Louis sinks back into his pillows. In the final days, the court gathers with the particular concentration of people who understand that an era is ending and want to be present for its close, not out of cruelty, but because in the world Louis XIV built, proximity to the king is the only currency that has ever truly mattered, and old habits do not release their grip even at a deathbed. Maintenant is there. She has been there throughout, sitting with him in the long hours, maintaining the composure of a woman who has survived everything else and intends to survive this too, though those who know her well can see what it costs. Louis drifts in and out of consciousness in the final hours. He murmurs prayers. He receives the last rites with the attentiveness of a man for whom religious ceremony has always been genuine as well as political. Whatever his many contradictions, his faith appears, in this final accounting, to be real. On September 1st, 1715, 4 days before what would have been his 77th birthday, Louis XIV dies. The silence that follows is enormous. Not because the palace is quiet. Palaces are never quiet. There are too many people and too many echoes. But there is a quality to the silence that falls in the moments after the physicians make their announcement that those present will struggle to describe afterward. Versailles has existed for 50 years as an extension of one man's will. Every corridor, every ceremony, every fountain and mirror and gilded ceiling was arranged around his continued presence at the center of things. And now the center is empty. The courtiers look at each other across the marble floors. The candles burn. Outside in the gardens, Apollo still rises from his fountain, the horses still rear, the water still catches the morning light. But the man who placed him there is gone, and the long, strange, brilliant, costly, magnificent performance that was the reign of Louis XIV closes, not with fanfare, not with a battle cry, but with a breath that simply does not come again. He reigned for 72 years and 110 days, longer than any monarch in the recorded history of Europe. He was born into a kingdom that was fragile and fearful, and he left behind one that was exhausted and transformed, diminished in its treasury and expanded in its borders, and changed irrevocably in the way it understood itself. The legacy is real. French became, in Louis's lifetime, the language of European diplomacy and would remain so for 2 centuries. The administrative centralization he pursued with such relentless consistency created the foundations of the modern French state. Versailles became the template against which every European court measured itself. Frederick the Great built Sanssouci in its image. Peter the Great built Peterhof. Princes across the continent hired French architects and French gardeners and French dancing masters in the hope that some portion of the Sun King's magnificence might be transferable. It was, and it wasn't. What could not be transferred was the particular alchemy of the man himself, the combination of genuine aesthetic intelligence, iron self-discipline, political instinct, and personal charisma that made the performance convincing for as long as it ran. His successors inherited the ceremonies without the conviction. They wore the costume without inhabiting the role. Within 74 years of his death, the system he built had collapsed into revolution, and the palace he constructed as the supreme symbol of royal authority became a museum. He would have found this incomprehensible, and yet, and this is the quiet question his life leaves behind, he was never entirely what he appeared to be. The absolute monarch was always constrained by finance, by geography, by the nobility he domesticated but could never fully control, by the coalitions that formed against him with increasing speed and efficiency as his reign lengthened, by the theater he created and then could not escape. The man who declared himself the state was also a man who fled Paris in the night at 10 years old, who gave up the woman he loved because France required otherwise, who sat at the end of his life and told a 5-year-old child not to repeat his mistakes. There is something deeply human in that final bedside scene, something that all the marble and all the mirrors could not entirely obscure. Power, Louis XIV's life suggests, is never quite what it looks like from the outside. It is always more contingent, more costly, more consuming than the performance allows the audience to see. The Sun King understood this better than almost anyone, and spent 72 years ensuring that no one else would know it. He almost succeeded. Almost. Rest now. Let the candles burn low. The gardens of Versailles are quiet at this hour, and the fountains have been still since nightfall. And somewhere in the long corridors of history, a boy of 10 is climbing into a carriage in the dark, beginning the education that will shape a century. Sweet dreams, and we'll meet again soon for another bedtime history documentary.